it's true that it's 2 years, almost perhaps 3 years of interaction in the Randall network. And it's a big pleasure for me to introduce Professor Randall here as the first speaker today. But not, well, actually he's going to give 2 talks today, so we actually are using from Randall, and I apologize, but that was such an exciting opportunity to have so many people that we wanted to invite for a long time, and we really want to create an interactive workshop this time where we can push a little bit the boundaries of what the network has done up to date, and maybe also to try to keep this interaction going. Maybe we won't have much funding in the future, but that shouldn't stop us interacting. And so, in order to start this workshop, Randall here is perhaps one of the right persons, because he has a lot of charges in the University of Indiana. He's a professor in the cognitive science program, also a computer science program of the School of Informatics and Computing. He's the director of the training program in Dynamics of Brain-Body Environment Systems, and member of the Center for Complex Networks and Systems Research, and also member for the integrative study of animal behavior in the University of Indiana, as I said. Randall was listed as a kind of a scientific NASDAQ or a stock market of a cognitive or scientific marketplace. He would be the kind of person you would really want to invest on. Because there is no speculation, no bubbles, no bullshit basically. It's a slowly and powerfully growing scientific profit. And his work has been growing and growing, contributing to a wide set of communities actually. In fact, if we were to abandon the stock market and the financial metaphor, if you really want to push the boundaries of science in one field forward, you really want to have Randall on board. He will quietly start working on a minimal model, what he calls minimal cognition, or small artificial simulations. And after a period of dedicated and work, he will deliver a big picture, maximal impact on the field. And that's something I really appreciate from his work, and we asked him to do a little summary of perhaps what's his main contribution. One of the main contributions certainly is to study with careful detail the complexity that come out of the agent and environment interaction. Perhaps to summarize in one sentence, the study of the dynamics between brain, body, and environment is Randall's main contribution. And this work has impact not only in artificial intelligence, evolutionary robotics, artificial life, but more generally in cognitive science and even philosophy of mind. So I just want to welcome Randall and let him talk.
Great. Thank you. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to talk here today. I'm going to try to jump ahead a little bit on track here. So, since I'm giving the first talk, I thought I would briefly mention this sort of perspective that I think this workshop is all about, but if not, at least this is the perspective I'm coming from, and it may be open to discussion. But basically, traditionally, there's been a big focus in neuroscience and cognitive science and artificial intelligence and robotics and so on looking for the mechanisms of behavior and intelligence inside the head, in the skull. It's all about the nervous system, or if you're not particularly neuroscientifically interested, some higher level description of what those mechanisms are actually doing. In contrast, in recent years, depending upon exactly how you want to look at the history, there's been a growing realization that brains occur in bodies, and bodies occur in environments, and bodies and environments both themselves have very rich and complicated properties. And then furthermore, brains, bodies, and environments are all in mutual ongoing interaction. And so this has led to a focus on what I call brain-body environment systems, and to the idea that that's the proper unit of analysis of behavior and cognition. You don't want to ascribe features of behavior and cognition, which are really systemic properties of this coupled system, to individual components such as traditionally the nervous system, although you can focus on other components as well. And I'm not going to defend this position here because that's a whole talk in and of itself. And again, I take the point of this workshop to discuss these kinds of ideas, not necessarily to lay out a defense on them. So what I want to focus on instead is the kinds of challenges that taking this sort of a picture seriously raise. And there are a variety of different challenges. Broadly speaking, there are an empirical set of challenges. How do you experimentally get your hands on all the relevant pieces and manipulate and measure as necessary to characterize these kinds of interactions? I'm not going to be talking about the empirical challenges. I'm a modeler, a theoretician, so I'm going to be talking about the other side of that, which is the theoretical or conceptual challenges with how to think about systems that are organized in this fashion. Now, there are many different ways one might approach grappling with these theoretical and conceptual issues. And what I want to tell you about is one particular way, the one that we've been focused on. And roughly speaking, I don't know, do I need to stand here, or can people hear me if I walk around okay? Because I actually prefer to move around. Okay, good. So my particular approach to sort of thinking about brain-body environment systems is by studying what in physics would be called toy models, or minimal models, or highly idealized, simplified models of brain-body environment systems for the purposes of building intuition, building our concepts, and building our mathematical and computational tools for thinking about these systems. And so the way we go about doing this is we take a particular neuromodel, which I'm just throwing up there. It doesn't really matter whether or not you're familiar with it. But the main thing I want to emphasize is a dynamic, recurrent neural network model. So our model of nervous systems is dynamic. That model is embodied in a model body, and that body in turn is situated in a model environment. And then we use evolutionary algorithms to evolve these model brain-body environment systems to accomplish some problem, some task, some behavior of interest. I'm going to give you examples of that in a minute. I'm not going to go through the details of an evolutionary algorithm, but roughly speaking, you have a population of possible settings, let's say, for parameters in this brain-body environment system, and you evaluate each of them on how well they perform the task you're interested in. Then you select individuals from that population based on their fitness. They go through various reproductive operators to create a new population, and then you repeat the process, basically. For my purposes, what's important about it is just that it's a way of finding sets of parameters in a brain-body environment system such that the whole system produces some desirable behavior. And then our focus actually is not even on that part. Our real interest begins once we've successfully evolved some brain-body environment systems that accomplish the behavior we're interested in, because then we focus on trying to understand how they work. And that's really, from my perspective, the purpose of this methodology, is that it gives us lots and lots of toy examples of brain-body environment systems that we can try to understand and see what conceptual and mathematical computational tools are necessary to really understand how these systems work, and then what kind of more general conclusions we might be able to draw from that process. The thing I particularly like about evolutionary algorithms is that by doing it this way, rather than just having me write down brain-body environment system models that do what I want, is that we're imposing less a priori theoretical bias on the brain-body environment systems that result. Rather than me thinking about how a system has to work, say, to accomplish locomotion, what I'm doing is, given a particular environment and body and neural architecture, what are the possible ways in which you can tune up the dynamics so that the whole system produces efficient walking? And then it becomes an interesting question to actually analyze that population of different solutions. If we run the evolutionary algorithm multiple times, we get a whole ensemble of possible solutions, and then we can study what are the commonalities across that ensemble, what are the differences between them, and so on. Let me just skip this, so I can try and keep on track. So what I want to do today is basically give you one example in some detail of how this process works from conceiving of the task that we're interested in evolving solutions to analyzing the actual solutions that we get. So I want to sort of go through this arc once to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Let me begin by just mentioning that we've done this for a whole variety of different behaviors, including motor behaviors like walking, which was the one that was in the picture, where we focused mostly on the interaction between neural dynamics and biomechanics, peripheral dynamics, in the generation of coordinated motor behavior. We've done some work on evolution of learning, where we've looked in particular, I'm just going to toss this out there, I'm not going to focus on it, but to be provocative, our main focus there has been actually evolving brain-body environment systems that can exhibit learning without actually having any synaptic plasticity in the underlying neural circuits. So we can talk more about that, but that's not going to be my focus right now. We've also done some more empirically grounded work where we're interested in using this methodology in conjunction with experimentalists, both in neuroscience and in psychology, as a way to build and tune models of particular phenomena that can then be experimentally tested. But the thing I'm going to be focusing on today for this talk is an area of work that we call minimally cognitive behavior. And the basic idea is fairly straightforward there. I'm not going to put forward any deep definition of what it means to be cognitive. Again, you can discuss that if you want, but that's something I want to get into here in this talk. I take a very pragmatic position. If I gave you one of my talks on, say, the motor behavior analyses we've done, if I do that to a room of motor control people, they usually find some of the results very interesting. But I've done it to rooms full of cognitive scientists, and they don't find it very interesting. And so my pragmatic definition of cognitive or minimally cognitive is the simplest task that actually would engage a room full of cognitive scientists. So, of course, your threshold may be different than mine, and so we've actually examined a whole range of different kinds of tasks, including things like perception of affordances, various categorization tasks, some short-term memory tasks, selective attention, communicative interactions between two agents about some third spatiotemporally distant agent, referential communication, and most recently looking at action switching between multiple behaviors as your internal and external environments change. And one of the challenges in all of this minimal work, and it's especially true in minimally cognitive behavior, is that you're constantly walking this line between complicated enough to be sufficiently interesting to a room full of cognitive scientists, and yet simple enough that you can still do all the things that we want to do with toy models. Okay? It's easy to make an overly simplified model that's trivial to understand that interests no one. It's also remarkably easy to make an incredibly intricate, rich, detailed model that fully engages the actual phenomena that nobody can understand. Okay, the trick is walking that fine line in the middle. And so we're constantly challenged to try to find the essence of some interesting, cognitively interesting task and try to capture that in our simpler models. And I want to show you an example of that today, and we'll see whether or not you're convinced. So the particular one I chose to focus on today is an example of relational categorization. So just very quickly, relational categorization is to be, many of you already know this, but just so we're all on the same page, I'm not sure what different backgrounds are. Relational categorization is to be opposed to sort of attribute or feature-based categorization. A feature of this object is that it's red. Okay, I can just look at or interact with this object and determine that if I'm, for example, sorting things into red and blue, that's a property of this object that it's red, and I can sort it into the red class. The fact that this object is a lot heavier than this object is a relational property, right? I can't just say, is this heavier than or not? It's only heavier than in comparison with another object, and so that's a relational property. And relational categorization is about sorting objects into classes based on relations between them rather than individual attributes. And that's what I mean by relational categorization. So this is fairly widely studied in cognitive science. For example, this is a sort of typical example where children are shown a set of objects in some spatial relation with various size and texture differences, and then asked to identify choose among another set of objects which ones demonstrate the same relation. So for the top left thing, we have a large circle between two small circles, and our choices are right below it. And the relationally same situation is when we have a large square between two small squares. That's an example of relational classification. And there's other things going on here. You can look at cross-dimensional kinds of generalizations of your relational classification. You can invert the polarity so that you're supposed to pick out. I show you examples of things where the larger object is between smaller objects, and you're supposed to pick out situations where the opposite is true. So you have a smaller object between two larger objects, and so on. So there's different ways of manipulating these kinds of things. One thing that's interesting about relational categorization is it's not just a property of humans. People have studied this in pigeons, for example, and people have even studied this in bees. Okay, where you train bees to fly down two different arms of a Y maze, and food is associated with the with situations where, say, one object appears above a black horizontal line, and no food is associated where it's below. And then you expose them to novel stimuli with differentiated by above and below relations, and they can reliably learn, even when you change the details of the objects, they can reliably learn to fly down the branch that's always associated with the above relation rather than the below relation. So it has some generality, which means it's also quite interesting. Now, there are a number of challenges to trying to build a minimal model of that sort of task. So, for example, most of the things I just showed you all are visually complex. You need a non-trivial visual system just to perceive these textures and relations between them. And that's a problem for us. And so, what I'm going to show you is how we responded to each of these challenges. So the way we dealt with visual complexity is we focused on a particular relation, which is the relation of size. So this is larger than this. That turns out to be much easier to perceive than fine details of shape and texture and so on. And again, I'm going to show you the model in just a second. Another challenge is that many of these experimental situations have motor complexity. So for example, the bees actually have to fly down and navigate this Y maze, which means there's flying and there's modulation of turning and so on. Children are pointing or reaching out and grabbing with a complex motor system. The pigeons are pecking at different things, which is how they communicate their choices. So we simplified the actual expression of the decision in terms of a catch or avoid response. So the way the decision gets expressed is simply by catching or avoiding the relevant object. The other thing that's very common in relational categorization is that it also is relational learning. So you typically don't probe people's ability to categorize, you train them to categorize, and then you probe their ability to generalize, okay, which brings learning into the picture as well. And the way we've dealt with that in this work is to basically just look at a simple model that can make a fixed relational categorical distinction. And finally, there's a lot of work, as I mentioned, on cross-dimensional generalization, which again, you really need a rich sensory system in order to generalize, because you have to be able to perceive texture or shape or something like that. So you can manipulate those things to generalize over. And what we've focused on is just a single dimension categorization. So putting all that together, the kind of model that we come up with is basically this. We have an agent in some environment that has some ability to move. Objects of various sorts fall toward it from top to bottom, and it can express its decisions, express its categorizations by the way in which it moves as these objects approach. So let me show you how that general idea can be applied. For example, we could drop two different size objects toward this agent and ask it to select the smallest one. That would be an example of how we could look at this relation size smaller than. What we actually did was a slightly more interesting version of the task. So what we do is we drop one object of a given size. I'm going to call that the Q object. The agent can do whatever it wants. We don't put any pressure on how it deals with that object. Once that object reaches the agent, it's removed from the world, and a second object is dropped of some other size. I'm going to call this the probe object. And the agent's job is to catch the second object if it's smaller than the previously experienced object and avoid it otherwise. So this is a kind of a relational categorization through time, which brings in a memory component as well. It makes it a little more interesting. we have a simple model that we put in this agent, so it has 7 distal sensors that it can detect what's out there at some distance from it. That's what these little gray lines are. It has a set of interneurons and a set of motor neurons and some architecture connecting them together. Remember, this is a recurrent network and they're dynamic. And it turns out, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, this architecture has 46 free parameters, 46 numbers for the genetic algorithm to adjust so that this whole system correctly classifies smaller than versus larger than situations. I don't know what the style is here, but this might be a good time to stop and just make sure everybody understands the task that I'm going to be talking about before I go on. No questions? Yes?
Do you get distance relations out of this?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah. There's size constancy essentially possible.
What's that?
There's size constancy that's possible from that network.
There is size.
In other words, the Q there and the first probe have the same visual angle, right? Yes. But it's possible for that network to distinguish that, yes, they're the same visual angle, but one object is far.
Well, except very coarsely, right? Because of the gaps in its visual field, if you will. So in fact, it turns out, again, I'm not talking about all this, but it turns out that typically you get very dynamic strategies in all these kinds of tasks. So you don't just, you actually move around and run arrays and so on. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But, so yes, but usually it's not just a simple matter of reading it off the visual array. There's usually some active perception that's going on. Okay, one of the other things I just want to mention about this methodology, because I don't want to oversell it, is that it can be very tricky to design the right fitness measure so that you evolve what you want. So for example, if you're not careful, what you evolve are agents that look at the first object and then based on the statistics of the objects you've exposed it to during evolution, guesses whether the second object is going to be smaller or larger. And you can do that if you know if the object sizes are bounded. Right? If you see a very small object initially, you can guess that it's unlikely the next object is going to be even smaller. And so, but it's not actually making the relational comparison. It's just encoding the statistics of the environment. So, I mean, that's interesting in and of itself. But if you don't want that to happen, you have to be careful how you craft your fitness function so that that is not rewarded, even partially, to do that kind of guessing. So there are 2 different kinds of strategies that evolve when we do these runs, which I'm going to call the passive and active strategies. And they're basically related to what Bill was just saying. In the passive strategy, just to show you one example, the agent sits stationary during the Q stage, and then when the probe object falls, it starts to move and do its thing and eventually express its decision. In this case, it avoided the second object because it was larger than the first object. In the active strategy, the agents move throughout the interaction, both during the Q stage and during the probe stage. Okay? And we see these in roughly equal numbers. So that's interesting. I'm going to focus right now on talking about how one of these passive agents works. But in the other talk I'm going to be giving this afternoon, this evening, whatever it is, I will talk a little bit about the active agents as well. Okay, again, does everybody, any questions about what the agent is doing in this simple task? Okay, well then what I want to talk about next is how one goes about analyzing how these agents work. And I'm going to introduce a few concepts to you in the next couple of slides and then walk you through, at a higher level, some of the things that one discovers about the best passive agents that we evolved among all the experiments that we ran. Okay? So today, right now, I'm going to be talking about dynamical analysis. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking about another kind of analysis. So I'm going to be using tools from dynamical systems theory. And really, all we need to know for now is that dynamical systems theory is a body of mathematics that's really designed to model and study systems that change over time in a very general sense. And when you can put systems in the right mathematical form to be treated using dynamical systems theory, there are a whole set of different kinds of tools that that you can bring to bear on studying those systems. And these are just some words. I'm not going to get to that level of detail in the talk today, but one can actually look at the properties of individual systems, and one can also look at the properties of families of dynamical systems as you start changing things about that individual system. Okay? So this is, I hope, the most mathematical slide of the whole talk. I want to try to communicate a little bit to you how one goes about setting up the problem of dynamically analyzing one of these toy brain-body environment systems. Dynamical systems theory is a body of mathematics, so it can be applied to anything that can be put in the right form. So we have an extra step that we have to do when we want to investigate a system via the tools of dynamical systems theory. We have that step when we're talking about an actual physical, biological, psychological system, but we also have that step when we're talking about a model. How are we going to apply the concepts of dynamical systems theory to our particular situation? So the sort of general framework that I've always worked in for over 20 years now, I guess, is the following. And I'm going to illustrate it with just an agent interacting with its environment. So the simplest possible dichotomy that you can set up. So we want to think of the agent as a dynamical system, and we want to think of the environment as a dynamical system. And I guess we don't have a pointer. So basically, I've represented each of these as differential equations, but that's not really essential either. The only thing that matters here is that we have some state variables associated with the agent, and they evolve according to some laws, which I've just called A, and that evolution depends upon the state variables associated with the environment through some sensory couplings. Okay? Conversely, the environment has its own state variables, which evolve according to some laws that I've expressed using the E, and that evolution depends through a motor interaction, in part on what the states of what the states of the agent are. So we have the dynamic equation for the evolution of the environment depending upon the states of the agent. We have the agent equation depending upon states of the environment, and that's mathematically, in dynamical systems terms, what it means to say these two things are individually dynamical systems and they're coupled in some way. Okay. Now, a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about basically involves taking that picture and looking at it in two different ways. So one way we can look at this, sort of formally as well as conceptually, is that we can look at this as just one big dynamical system, which I'm just going to call U, whose states are just the union of the agent and environment states, and whose law is the union of the laws and the couplings between the individual agent and environments. Okay. So I've not done anything here but sort of just reframed the picture so I'm not making this, in some sense, artificial distinction between the agent states and the environment states. And this is in a form, then, that you can completely apply all of the tools of dynamical systems to. The technical term is, this is an autonomous dynamical system, which means something very different than the word autonomous that may also get used here multiple times. Autonomous in dynamical systems terms is just a mathematical term that essentially means the system has no time-varying inputs. Okay? So if you specify these laws, everything is fixed. And in principle, you can do a complete dynamical analysis of that system and see what it can do over time, what kinds of behaviors it will have, and so on. So that's one way of looking at this system. The other way of looking at this system is actually taking this distinction between the agent and the environment very seriously and pulling them apart as two separate dynamical systems, each of which receives time-varying inputs. Okay? So now I've made a slight change in notation. No longer is S a function of the states of the environment. S is just some function in time. Okay? I've decoupled the two systems now. And likewise for the environment, M is no longer a function of what the agent does, it's a function of time. Again, technically these are called non-autonomous dynamical systems now because they're being driven by time-varying inputs. Okay? And unfortunately, this version of things, the tools of dynamical systems theory, are not well developed for dealing with non-autonomous situations. And so we use something that's called a quasi-static approximation, which basically says that let me treat each of these individual systems as if S were not changing in time, but were instead a set of parameters that I can set to any value I want. That makes this now an autonomous dynamical system that depends on some parameters. And doing the same thing with the environment makes it an autonomous dynamical system doing, depending on some parameters. And just to show you very concretely what that means, suppose I have a one-dimensional agent, just to be able to draw the picture, that depends on one parameter, S. Well, the tools of dynamical systems theory let me calculate this blue and red curve, which basically says if you pick any given S and read up to that curve, it will tell you where the state will settle in that system in the future. Okay? That's the kind of result you can get from a dynamical systems analysis. But then, of course, S is really varying in time. And if you vary S in time, what you're doing is moving back and forth across this axis. The parameter itself is changing. And as the parameter changes, the equilibrium point moves. The place you're going to moves. And so you're chasing this moving point all over the place. And what you see is that the actual trajectory that you get for some given variation of time can be understood in terms of being pulled toward or pushed away from this steady state long-term behavior, which lets us relate the autonomous dynamics here to the non-autonomous dynamics there. Anyway, like I said, this was the most technical slide of them all. And the punchline I want to leave you with is simply the following, that most of what I mean when I'm doing analysis is to try to relate the properties of the entire system to the properties of the individual components and the way they interact. Okay, so it's trying to relate this big picture autonomous version to this dichotomous, this pulled apart pair of non-autonomous systems. Now, that same idea can be applied at any different level. The same story I just told you could be reiterated. I can reiterate it if I subdivide the agent into a body and a nervous system. I can pull them apart and look at the interactions there. I can pull the nervous system out and look at its interaction between a body dynamics and a neural dynamics. I can actually pull the nervous system apart into subcircuits, each of which are non-autonomous dynamical systems. So you can apply the same strategy at any level. In addition, you can reify the environment so that you make explicit the fact that it contains other agents. And you can look at the dynamical interactions between the agents and their environment using this sort of same methodology. All right, so let me show you how this plays out in our passive relational categorization agent. So, what this picture is going to show you is one of these evolved agents now that does successfully do a relational categorization. As I drop a Q object of a given size, dynamically what happens? And what I'm plotting here are the states of its neurons, of its inner neurons specifically. Okay? And let me explain the things you're seeing here. So the blue and green dots have to do with this autonomous dynamic analysis. The blue dots are attractors. They are equilibrium points that if you stop the system, the state would move toward a given equilibrium point. This green point is a saddle point, and we don't need to worry about it. The only point I wanted to make here is we have two stable equilibrium points, and the current trajectory is heading to one of them because each equilibrium point is surrounded by what's called a basin of attraction. If you're near one, you're going to get pulled towards it, whereas if you're near the other one, you'll be pulled towards it. Okay. This black point is where the state of the system begins when you first start dropping a Q object. And this blue trajectory is, if I froze the falling object and the agent at a given point in time, this is the trajectory that the state would follow as it got closer and closer to the equilibrium point. Okay? And the brown here is the past, how far it's moved up to this point where I froze everything. All I'm trying to do is set up the following movie, which is that as the object falls, because this is a non-autonomous system, the steady state equilibrium dynamics is changing, and the actual state of the system is getting pulled around in ways that always pull it towards its current equilibrium point. And at the end, when this object has reached the agent, you basically end up right there. Okay, that's the main take-home from that. And that's for a particular Q size. If I do a different size Q, you'll see a similar but not identical story going on. And the main point I want to make here is that the place you end up in after seeing a Q of size 20 is different than the place you end up in after seeing a Q of size 50. So now we can make a picture of, imagine doing that experiment for all possible Q size values. You end up with a picture that looks like this. Okay. So we always start here, but depending upon the size of the Q, we follow different trajectories. And when the Q reaches the object, we find ourselves in different locations in the interneuronal state space that lie along the curve. Okay, I don't know if this is how clear this is. Again, please ask questions if it's unclear. So at the end of the Q size, at the end of the Q stage, we have this curve of possibilities, which I've shown you briefly where that comes from without getting into all the details. Interestingly, if we look, the smallest Q size object ends up here, the largest Q size object ends up here. So this is actually evolved so that the sizes of the Qs are arranged in a nice increasing or decreasing order along this curve. And there's some other details which I'm going to skip about that shape. Let me just go to the probe stage. So at the end of the Q stage, we're arranged along this curve of the interneuronal states. The Q goes away, and now we drop a probe. And that probe object can also be of a range of different sizes. Okay? So first of all, let me just show you overall what happens. So we're starting at different points along this curve depending upon the Q that we experience, right? And then as we drop the probe, we evolve away from that curve along one of these trajectories. So I'm just showing you a bunch of different possible probe sizes. And the key thing to notice here is that this splits into two bundles. There's this bundle that I've colored blue and this bundle that I've colored red. And the blue bundle corresponds to situations where the probe is less than the Q size, and the red bundle corresponds to situations where the probe size is greater than the Q size. So all you're seeing here is in the state of the brain of this simple model, this discrimination taking place as this set of trajectories split into two bundles. Okay. Now, I'm skipping a whole part of the story here, which I can get away with in this agent. This split occurs before the agent starts to move during the probe stage. Yes?
The protein here, the non-autonomous dynamics of the agent?
I'm sorry?
This is the non-autonomous dynamics of the agent?
This is just plotting. If I drop a probe after having seen a given Q, I'm just recording the trajectory that the agent produces. I'm not splitting anything.
The phase space corresponds to state variables only of the agent?
This corresponds to the interneuronal state variables, not all of the state variables. But what I just said was that we can ignore the body state variables in this case because the agent hasn't started to move yet. Okay? In the active agents, we can't do that because they move all the time. And I'm going to talk about that in the other talk. But I'm not sure, did I answer your question? Or?
This is non-autonomous dynamical system, what you are plotting, that's my question.
Well, this is...
This universal system in which everything is coupled and happy?
It's... I mean, to be careful, what I'm showing you is actually not a single dynamical system. It's a family of dynamical systems that correspond to all the possible settings of the Q size and the probe size. And that's why you're seeing all these different trajectories superimposed. I'm showing you how the whole family behaves. Okay? But it's also true that one can argue even the whole system is non-autonomous because of the fact that the object is falling. And you can think of that as a time-varying input. I actually think it's better not to, because you can turn any one of those kind of systems into an autonomous system by just writing another differential equation that describes the fall. And that's the way I think of it. So I would say the way I'm thinking of this is it's an autonomous dynamical system, but it's a whole family of them that I'm superimposing all the different Q and probe sizes on. Okay, so the question that we want to answer is, I showed you how briefly this structure develops. Now I want to understand something about how this separation occurs, because it's that separation that underlies the actual discrimination action that the agent takes. So one thing I want to first do is point out to you that there's an interesting structure to this. If I draw this picture a little differently and look at any given point in time, where can I find the trajectories in this state space? What I see is I actually get a surface, a two-dimensional surface that's kind of kinked in the middle and curved around a little bit. It's very analogous to this curve. This curve, where I end up on this curve at the end of Q stage depends on the Q size. Where I end up on this surface at any time during the probe stage depends on the Q and probe sizes, which gives me this two-dimensional structure in a state space. Okay? And one thing I've shown you here is that eventually, not yet, but we know eventually parts of this surface, the ones I've colored blue, are going to split off and go one way, and parts of this surface, the ones I've colored red, are going to split off and go the other way. So early in the probe stage, there's this distinction being made according to this Q and probe sizes. And that's the surface that we get. And then something happens, which I have to explain to you yet, that somehow pulls that surface apart into two pieces, which is the actual classification. So something splits the surface right along the seam between the blue and the red. And it turns out that what splits that surface is a bifurcation that takes place in the interneuronal dynamics as the object gets closer and closer. So initially, I could have told you the same story about every one of these trajectories I told you earlier. It's in the basin of attraction of some equilibrium point, and it's just being pulled towards it. There was only ever one. Okay? But at some point, as the probe object gets closer and closer, what happens is a bifurcation occurs, and suddenly there are two stable equilibrium points that you can be pulled toward. Okay? And there's a boundary between them where the one basin of attraction butts up against the other basin of attraction. And roughly speaking, it's a little more subtle than this, but roughly speaking, the part of the surface that lands on one side of that basin boundary goes one way, and the part of the surface that lands on the other side of that basin boundary goes the other way. Okay? So this bifurcation takes a very small variation in neuronal state that depends on Q and probe size and amplifies it to a large variation in neuronal state that actually drives the behavior to catch or avoid. And I'm not showing how that motor thing plays out. I'm focusing just on the categorical distinction that's being drawn here. And let's skip that, I think. Yeah, I guess I'll say one thing about it, because I'm almost done, and it's just about 50 minutes, which I think was what I was supposed to do. So we'll get us back on track here. Just like these equilibrium points are moving over time, as I've shown you, right? This basin boundary is also moving over time. Okay? So if I did a movie of this, you'd actually see this line moving and these trajectories moving too. So imagine, let's try how to make this. So imagine we had a line of people here, all standing next to one another, okay? And we're kind of walking along as a line, and a split opens up in the floor. The simple version is that the people on one side of the split would go one way, and the people on the other side of the split would go the other way, right? That's the metaphor. But in fact, it's a little more subtle than that, what's going on here. The split itself is moving as the people do. So I could find myself on this side of the split, and as I go this way, the split actually moves underneath me, and now I'm on the other side of the split. And that actually plays a role here. So it's a combination, it's a race, as it were, between where the trajectories are going under the current dynamics and how that dynamics is changing. And so it's the combination of those two things that give rise And I'm not sure you can see it, but there's actually a case here where a trajectory that ends up on the blue side actually starts out on the red side, and the line moves under it, and now it's on the blue side and gets classified this way. So there's these subtle details of geometry and timing that the evolutionary algorithm adjusts, evolves, in order to make this very fine categorical distinction about sizes of objects. Okay, let me wrap up, and then I will be done. So what I've basically tried to lay out here very briefly, very quickly, is a sort of general research program about trying to understand brain-body environment systems and their dynamics and how we need to think about them and what tools we need to bring to bear and so on, using toy models, using highly simplified models that are still non-trivial and rich in their details. I've suggested and tried to demonstrate to you one particular way of doing that, which is to use these evolutionary algorithms as a way to build up these models. And then because the evolutionary process sets the details of how they work, rather than me setting them as an engineer or something, designing them, it becomes an interesting question to actually investigate how they work. And I've shown, today I focused on the idea that some of the behaviors that we can investigate in this fashion actually address kinds of competencies that are studied in cognitive science, like relational categorization. So that led me to this idea of minimally cognitive behavior, and try to find really simple toy instances of some of these tasks and set up this evolutionary methodology to investigate them. And the example we talked about, as I said, is relational categorization. And finally, I've tried to sketch very, very briefly how one goes about doing this analysis. I've glossed over a lot of details here, but the point I wanted to get across is just that the tools of dynamical systems can be brought to bear in understanding how the brain-body environment dynamics and its interaction underlie these behaviors. And we don't just do it once on one agent the way I've shown you. What we try to do is do it on many, many agents and build up a more general understanding. Clearly there are going to be particular details about one evolved agent as compared to another one that aren't particularly interesting. What we are interested in is what general features do you see consistently, say, in the passive agents versus the active agents. Okay? And my last slide then, which is mostly going to be just a teaser for the later talk, is the following. There's a lot of different ideas, and maybe this will be something people want to talk about, I don't know, a lot of different ideas about what it means to take a dynamical approach to cognition. Some people, like Tim Van Gelder, actually want to hold a dynamical hypothesis up at the same level as a computational hypothesis. So it's this sort of theory of cognition. What I'm doing here is somewhat different. What I'm basically doing is saying we have a brain-body environment system. It could be real, it could be a model, as in my case. And I think of dynamical systems theory as not a scientific set of assumptions or a scientific theory. It's a body of mathematics. And that mathematics provides a lens through which we can look at a particular system. And that particular lens reveals certain features about the system, which we can then build into theories that we create. Okay? But there are other mathematical lenses we can also look through. What I'm going to be talking about later today is applying the tools of information theory, which again is a mathematical theory, which isn't the same thing as information processing or the computational theory of mind or so on. It's just a body of mathematics grounded in Shannon. That also provides a lens that we can look at systems through, and it reveals different features of the operation of some system than dynamical systems theory does. And in particular, what we're interested in right now, what a lot of my work involves, is what's the relationship between those two stories when you apply both lenses, information theoretic and dynamical systems, to the same system. You get two different, so you see two different things, let's say, and how are those two things linked? How do they fit together? So, okay, thank you. So, you want to turn the lights on now?
Yeah, maybe. Try it. Because they have quite a big area, and I don't know the difference. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes discussion before the coffee break. Any questions? I have some of my own, but go ahead.
I have a question concerning your mathematical model of the agent and environment. As you say, the state of the agent changes because of the own state of the agent and the sensor inputs, and you say that the environment is changing because of its internal change and the motor acting.
It's difficult to understand. I think the
acoustics arrows in here, yes.
Well, my question is, those sensors and actuators are at the boundary between the agent and the world.
The sensors and motors they cross the boundary.
Yeah.
They're functions in the mathematical description.
My question is that looks like causality is going in some direction in sensor and actuators. Yeah. And I think that the internal dynamics of the agent is also driven by the motor part.
It is, yes. So in the passive agent, this is a simplification, is why I picked it for this talk. In the passive agent, it doesn't start moving until after I cut off the story. Okay, so everything I've shown you is driven causally from the sensors to the internal dynamics, and then it moves. But the active agents, that's not true. And they have a very different, interesting story, which I think is actually better revealed through the information theoretic analysis, which I'll talk about later, where it's definitely a bidirectional thing. Okay, so one thing I like about this sort of a framework is that you don't have to presume a priori whether any particular agent is primarily being driven internally or externally or some mixture of the two. That's one of the things to be discovered through the analysis. Does that answer your question?
It's not a very theoretical question, but I just wanted to know how you go about not rewarding and encoding the world statistics. It sounds like that's impossible.
It's a matter of you form averages. You form these aggregate measures. It's actually in the eCal paper, and I can show it to you. But you actually form these aggregate measures which average over things in such a way that there's really no win for doing that. So it's simply a matter of how you group the different probe Q combinations. You average them in a certain way, and then you average those aggregates, and there's basically, if you're just doing that trick, that just averages out. It's only the things where you're really catching the relationship between the two. But it is tricky. And anybody who's done evolutionary robotics knows how tricky it can be to design fitness measures.
So, I have a more theoretical question.
Is yours theoretical?
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Maybe we can leave theoretical for later if you wanted to explain in theoretical.
Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I mean, it's very philosophical even, but I mean, just I mean, the way you're doing things here, you're kind of always this is very much outside the domain that you just presented, really. But you're always presupposing a certain structure of brain model environment, so the neurons can only affect the world by affecting the motor a certain way. I mean, just as a very broad question, is there any way to sort of think about moving beyond that, to having systems where what becomes the body and what becomes the world?
I mean, so first of all, as you know from the talk I gave a few days ago, I'm also very interested in that issue of how one systematically draws the boundary between, say, an agent and its environment. In this kind of work, where you're focused not on constitution but on behavior, I think in many cases this is a legitimate kind of abstraction to make. But I mean, in order to apply dynamical systems ideas, you just have to have some set of equations. So, I mean, you could, for example, introduce additional states that effectively, change the kinds of sensory couplings you can have. It's just the space of possibilities is predetermined. That's sort of built into the dynamical systems thing, right? There is some state space. But part of the work on learning without synaptic plasticity is kind of all about that, is that you can fold multiple levels of change into the same system, essentially. But you can't ever get outside of, whatever changes you actually allow in the model in traditional dynamical systems.
So as the system gets more complex, so we've got 3 neurons, you can kind of analyze that. As you start to have more and more nervous system, you reach a point at which you can kind of, by analogy, extend the concepts, right? The tractors and bifurcations and separations and so on. But to actually do any kind of analysis of that becomes prohibitive pretty quickly.
Again, it depends on what level you want to do. Doing this sort of microdynamical analysis that I've done here, you're absolutely right. But as you know very well, you don't necessarily, and I tried to emphasize earlier in that one slide with all the different ways of cutting things up, you can apply dynamical ideas at many, many different levels. The other thing is, part of my motivation for moving to information theory was a way to deal with that. And that's why I'm particularly interested in the bridge between the two languages, so that if I learn something dynamically, what does that imply information theoretically about the system? And conversely, if I can say something information theoretically about the system, what does that imply dynamically? And that's a way, I mean, the information theory scales much better than dynamical systems theory simply because you can do these statistically averaged quantities. Although, interestingly, the more you average, of course, the less specific you can be about the dynamical underpinning. So there is this fundamental trade-off.
Do you have a question? If nobody takes the next one. So one of the things that I enjoyed from your work was the fact that, unlike this particular example that you've shown, so maybe I want you to comment on this. In this particular case, because the agent is static, and maybe because of some other dynamic configurations, but I think that's necessary that the agent is static, there is an isomorphism between brain dynamics and the actual categorization in terms of the state space and bifurcation diagram. But in many of your previous examples that you've shown in different talks and papers, that doesn't have to be the case.
No.
So,
and it's not the case in the active agents,
yeah,
which I didn't talk about because it's more complicated. But the same analysis applies. It's just that some of your axes are not neuronal states anymore. They become positional states in this agent. The X, the agent's position, is now another axis of dynamics, but you can do the same pictures and the same analysis in that extended state space. It's just that, I mean, I made this point earlier to someone, I don't remember who it was. I think it's important that the tools you use be neutral about that, so that they work both in systems where it turns out that it's fundamentally the interaction and the embodied, feedback loop and so on, but they also work in systems where it's not. And that fact about a system is something to be discovered through analysis, not presumed by your analysis technique. And both the information theoretic stuff, I'm going to talk about it in dynamical stuff, makes no distinction between environmental variables, body variables, and neuronal variables.
But for the mainstream theory that assumes there has to be some isomorphism between brain or internal states and the environment, and this isomorphism grounds the representational theory of mind, well, maybe you can comment a little bit on the fact that this doesn't have to be the case when you're active, although it was in this particular case when he claimed that.
So here's a really interesting question, and it's something we've grappled with. I'm not going to tell you the answer because I don't know the answer, but it's worth thinking about in the context of this model, and that's why I think these kind of models are useful. And this is like to everyone individually. Do you want to call, and I'll show this more with the information analysis, but you can already kind of see it here. Do you want to call that curve in state space a representation of the size of the cube?
Don't ask me that question, please.
No, I'm asking everyone. I'm not asking. It starts to push at both the representationalist and anti-representationalist positions to just ask yourself how you feel about that, especially in light of the information stuff I'm going to show you later. And think about it, think about it, because it pushes the issue a little bit. I'm not sure how to respond personally. So, I mean, I think there's a sense in which you can say this is what people mean when they talk about representations, although I also am going to show a little bit later that I think there are some problems if you define representation in those terms.
Any other question? Well, let's thank again Randall and go for a coffee break.